Thank you for downloading this podcast from the British Theatre Guide. For more information about British Theatre Guide, please visit britishtheatreguide.info. David Wood OBE, described by the late great Times theatre critic Irving Wardle as the national children's dramatist, has written more than 70 plays, including adaptations of Judith Kerr's The Tiger Who Came to Tea, Michelle Magorian's Goodnight Mr. Tom, Philippa Pearce's Tom's Midnight Garden, and a number of books by Roald Dahl, including The BFG, The Witches, Danny Champion of the World, The Twits, James and the Giant Peach, and more, as well as original plays of his own, such as The Gingerbread Man, The Selfish Shellfish, and Save the Human. From 1959 until 2005, David kept up regular correspondence with Frank Whitbourn, whom he credits as his mentor, which is currently being edited into a book called Frank Exchanges, to be published by the Book Guild later this year. Through the edited letters and some supplementary notes, the book charts David's professional life as an actor and writer, from his performances in school and amateur productions right up to Frank's death in 2005, including Frank's incisive comments on David's scripts, proposed projects and productions of his plays. I spoke to David when he was still working on the manuscript with editor Chris Abbott and asked him how his friendship and correspondence with Frank first came about.
Well, back in 1958, I was 14 and theatre mad. And my headmaster at the grammar school in Chichester, looking back, he was very good, because he suggested I go on this residential summer week-long drama course in the West Sussex County Council remit, as it were. And I did, and it turned out to be what I still consider to be the best week of my life, really, because there were people there who were interested in what I was interested in. And in those days, you kept quite quiet at school about an interest in theatre, sadly. Although I was in school plays and all that was all right, but it was, I was totally unsporty. and I was already sort of doing amateur things, and I was doing magic shows at children's parties and all that. But so at 14, off I go. And the first person I met was this man, Frank Whitbourn, who was running the course. And he was a teacher at Collier's School in Horsham. And I suppose had been asked by the county council to run the course. I don't think it was his idea to run I'm not sure. But they had several adults there who were directing plays, because we did 2 or 3 excerpts from plays, and we had all sorts of workshops and movement and voice and all those things, and we made props, and it was just that thing of working very hard and getting very tired, and loving the fact that you were working hard and getting tired, and putting on 3 excerpts from plays for parents and other people at the end of the week. But during that week, I was the youngest on the course, and Frank was in one of the things that I was in, which was an excerpt from Dark of the Moon. And there's a sort of revivalist meeting in there, and he was playing Preacher Haggler, and we were all sitting on the bench doing sort of revivalist type thing. And at one point he said, would I hear his lines? And so I did. And he was obviously very good with everybody, but I just recognized the fact that here was someone who was interested in what I was interested in, knew far more than I did about it, encouraged us all to call him by his Christian name, which in those days for a teacher, was extraordinary. Yeah. And after that week, after which I had withdrawal symptoms, there was that awful thing of walking along a road, and everybody you saw you thought was somebody from the course, and then you were disappointed. So I was so into it. And he had written a nativity play, rather a sort of gritty nativity play, really, which was going to be put on in a church in Chichester, which happened to be where I was at school. And he was directing it, and he asked me to be in it. And I think I played the innkeeper, and he sent me a very nice letter afterwards. And then as a result of that, I invited him to come and see my school play. And I was playing the lead in Malade Imaginaire, the Molière. And I was quite young to be playing the lead in a school play. And I remember in the year above me, or would it even been 2 years above me, was David Horlock, who was a very good actor and who later went on to run Salisbury Playhouse, and he was at Bristol Old Vic as the number 2 director for a time. Lovely, lovely man. And he was a bit miffed that I had ousted him from his role, which he should have been playing in his view, because it was his turn, as it were. And he was in the second year, 6th, was he, or first year, 6th? And I was only in the 5th form. But that performance convinced me that, yes, that was what I wanted to do. I wanted to go on the stage. And Frank came to see it, and he sent me a fan letter afterwards, which was very, very flattering. I mean, he said it was the best schoolboy performance he'd ever seen and so on. And that started off this, well, it was a correspondence, but we wouldn't have thought of it like that then, because I went on 5 of these courses every year for the next 4 years. And we started a group who went out to church halls doing a review. So I was in touch with him for those 5 years, and the letters weren't important. And then I got into Oxford, and getting into Oxford, it was a strange thing for me because I'd wanted to go to drama school, really. Yeah. and my headmaster had said, "Oh, no, go to university, you're capable," and all that. And everybody talked about having something to fall back on, which is what they used to say in those days. And I tried to get into Bristol University because in those days you could read drama at only Manchester or Bristol. And Bristol, I could do drama and French. You had to do it with another subject. Anyway, I failed to get in. And so I thought, oh, God, I've wasted, 18 months of my life or whatever. I shouldn't have been doing A-levels. I should have gone straight to drama school. And my headmaster, who looking back he was very good for me. He wasn't good for everybody, but he said, "Oh, well, don't worry." He said, we'll try and get you into Oxford. And I thought, well, if I can't get into Bristol, I won't get into Oxford. But I did. And it was partly because of my interest in magic and theatre, I think, that I got in. I probably wouldn't get in these days. I think these days you have to be academically extremely good. Yeah. And I wasn't. I mean, but I'm good enough to get a degree. And I did scrape through with a gentleman's third, as it used to be called. But Frank, because he had been to Oxford, was obviously pleased about that. And he came to see shows that I was in. I was very fortunate at Oxford. I was there at a very rich theatrical time. I was there with Michael Palin, Terry Jones, Mariah Aitken, Diana Quick, Nigel Rees of Quote Unquote on the radio, John Sargent, who became the Blue Club. And we were I was in the West End twice as a student, which was unheard of. And I did 3 Edinburgh festivals, as we all did, and I toured Europe. And so I would have kept in touch with Frank during all that time. And the sad thing is there is a bit missing. There are some, what were obviously some letters that were missing when I was at Oxford. But later on, by which time I'd started writing plays for children, and he had started telling me about when he had worked, not in children's theatre, because it wouldn't have been called that then, but when there were sort of matinees for families and children, he had done a certain amount. And gradually this became a dialogue between us. And in it, he would tell me lots of things about his past and philosophize a bit about how children's theatre was so underrated and undervalued. And meanwhile, I was trying to reverse that situation with the work that I was doing. So he was encouraging me in that. And I was also, without really realizing it, I was setting down on paper what was going on over a long period of time, all my fights with the Arts Council, all the funding problems we had when we set up my company, Whirlygig Theatre, which toured on and off for 25 years. And so I suppose I was being as honest as I could be with him, saying things that I wouldn't have said to anybody else. And there was this realization towards the end of his life. He died aged 94, but was still sending me wonderful critiques and suggestions, because I always used to send him the first draft of everything I wrote. And I suddenly realized that I had kept so many of his letters, and then found out after he died that he had kept mine. And so the idea came to try and put them together and assemble them into a book, which is what we've done. And I found a lovely editor called Chris Abbott, who has done a great job whittling it down, because, I mean, a lot of the letters were very, very long. Yeah. But we've tried to make it into a sort of through line of my development, if you like, I suppose, as a writer of plays for children. And from his point of view, this thing of being able to remember with a certain amount of nostalgia his theatrical experiences of the past.
Yeah. Have you found, I mean, I find sometimes if you look back at old diaries or old things that I've written, that the way I describe it then isn't how I remember it. But presumably the one I wrote then is the accurate one because it was contemporary to things happening. Did you find in these letters things weren't quite as you remembered them?
I think there is a certain amount of truth in that I've always tried to have half a full glass rather than half an empty glass, so that there have been a lot of what I call ones that got away, things that, one really felt were rather good and should have taken off but didn't. And I mean, I've been very fortunate because they have been balanced out very nicely by things which have worked. But what is quite interesting is how you do remember certain things with rosier glasses than perhaps you should, and you remember the good things about them. So if there was a production which went off at half cock and suddenly, I'll give an example, the Witches, my Roald Dahl adaptation. I look back on that with tremendous affection because it was very successful. It came into the West End 3 times. And it toured very successfully, and it combined various things for me which were important. One of which was illusion, magic, because I was a member of the Magic Circle. And although the magic was designed by Paul Keeve, who later went on to do, Matilda and all the big shows, he's brilliant. Yeah. And he had done The Invisible Man for Stratford East, and then he came to me to do The Witches and did it absolutely brilliantly. But there were things about that show that I had forgotten. And when I went back to Diary, I suddenly discovered that the second tour, during it, the management sort of went under, and we had to close the tour early, about 6 weeks early. I went up to the Grand Theatre, Leeds, in order to, quite why I had to, I don't know, but I went up to tell the company that sadly, at the end of that week, they were going to be out of work, because I was nothing to do with that company, which was a commercial touring company. And so my rose-coloured glasses had forgotten that. And they'd also forgotten that a consortium of the remaining theatres in the tour clubbed together in order to try and save the rest of the tour. And I thought, oh, marvellous, that's great. But that was impossible because the company that was doing all the removals of the set, of the transport of the set and costumes and everything between venues, hadn't been paid for 10 weeks or whatever, and they impounded the set and and the costume, everything. They said you can't have it back. So this attempt to get it relaunched and everything failed. And that had all sorts of implications, I remember, because Paul Keeve technically owned some of the illusions which were used, which were they didn't look like magic tricks. They looked like ordinary things that you might see in a hotel restaurant, like in The Witches. But they were technically his property. Yeah. But they were all locked up. So things like that, I was interested to come back to. But no, on the whole, what was a real delight was coming back to just the way he writes and the witticisms and the odd bit of wordplay and the sheer joy of talking about theatre, which was infectious, And we both had this thing about J.M. Barrie and Peter Pan. Peter Pan had a huge effect on me as a child. That was the thing that I was taken to. I suppose one of the first things I was ever taken to see. And each year my parents would say, what do you want to go and see? And every year I would say Peter Pan. Because I think children are quite conservative creatures. And what if you like what that's what you want. And so I saw it at the Scala year after year. And I think it must have had a major influence on me. And I got interested in J.M. Barrie, and I still am. I mean, there's a production on tour at the moment of Quality Street, which is an extraordinary play and not one that one would expect to see these days, but they are touring it. So I think I'm going to go and see it. And he was so huge at the time, Barrie. I mean, I think we forget. It's rather like A.A. Milne. A.A. Milne, as an adult playwright, was the most successful playwright in London for years. And then, of course, he got saddled with something called Winnie the Pooh, A.A. Milne, and resented it. Yeah. And indeed, I think Barrie, to a certain extent, resented Peter Pan, which was looked upon. I mean, I think it's a very adult play, Peter Pan, but it was looked upon as a family event for people to go to. And I think he rather resented that some of his other plays were less celebrated as the years went by. But sharing that sort of interest with Frank was a slightly different aspect of the letters, and less of just me saying, this is what I'm doing now, what do you think of that? And showing off or whatever. In common with Milne and Barrie, there was a point where it looked as though you weren't sure about which direction you were going in, whether it was somehow, were you thinking it was somehow lesser, or did you think other people thought children's theatre was somehow lesser than writing adult plays? Yeah, I mean, I've thought about this quite a lot. There was a situation when I was at Oxford, we were involved in a show called Hang Down Your Head and Die, which was an anti-capital punishment review. And it was conceived by Graham Murray, who died a couple of years ago, who ran the Royal Exchange in Manchester for years after that. And David Wright, who was a writer who sadly died, 20 or more years ago now. And it was sort of theatre workshop, really. It was Joan Littlewood, really. Yeah. We set it in a circus, just as she'd done with Pierrot's for Oh, What a Lovely War. And I wrote a lot of the songs, which was a whole other story as to how that came about. And suddenly we transferred to the West End, and we were at the Comedy for a season over the Easter holidays, I suppose it was. And I got nominated as Best Newcomer to the West. And, I was still in my first year at university. It was crazy. I got an agent. I got London management suddenly signed me up as a writer. Michael Codron commissioned me to write a musical. And, I mean, it was ridiculous. Then I was asked to be in a West End review at the Mayfair Theatre, along with Dilys Lay, I remember, who years later played the grandmother in, funnily enough, The Witches, which we mentioned earlier, and Carol Shelley, who has been in America for a long time. And I was to write the songs for this review. I was 21 or something, and Harold Pinter was to write the sketches. I mean, it was surreal. In the end, that all fell through, and I went back to Oxford and everything, and I stayed for the full 3 years and had a wonderful time. But I wasn't writing children's plays. I was still interested in my children's magic shows. But David, with whom I'd worked on Hang Down Your Head, asked me to work on another show with him when I left Oxford. And this, first of all, was called A Life in Bedrooms, and it was commissioned by the Travis in Edinburgh. And it was a musical play about the infamous rector of Stifkey or Stookie, Harold Davidson, who in 1932, he was often called the prostitute's padre, but he was the theatre chaplain in the West End, and at the same time was rector of a tiny parish in Norfolk. And he was accused of immoral behaviour with girls in the West End, who he was trying to apparently save, if you like. And in 1932, he was defrocked in Norwich Cathedral. And it was an extraordinary story because he was an eccentric. He trained as an actor, and he ended up doing weird things like preaching in a barrel on Blackpool front. And then he went to Skegness and did a summer season in a lion's den with real lions, pretending to be Daniel, protesting his innocence and so on. And he was mauled to death by a lion. And this extraordinary story was so appealing. We felt, I think, that but even by whenever this was, the late 60s, early 70s, he would have been regarded as more of a saint than a sinner, probably in those days. And so we wrote this show. And it was picked up for the West End, and it came, totally different production by then, but it came to the Queen's Theatre, now the Sondheim, and it was a total disaster. And it was much bigger than it should have been. They put dancing girls in anyway, we were so inexperienced that we weren't able to say, no, that's wrong. But I think that had an effect on me, whereby that was an adult show and it didn't quite work. And round about the same time, I'd started doing the children's shows. And in 1968, The Owl and the Pussycat Went to Sea, which I'd co-written for the Swan Theatre, Worcester. I was able to see 10 performances of it at the end of its run. I'd been doing a show as an actor in Manchester, but it finished early enough for me to nip down to Worcester, see 2 shows every day for 5 days. And the reaction of those children was just so exciting to me. I got such a buzz out of it because it was this wonderful, honest, uncynical reaction, which made me think this show cannot end here. I've got to do something. And so although I was still working very much as an actor, and that was the same year as I did If, the Lindsay Anderson film alongside Malcolm McDowell, which, I mean, I'm still doing Q&As about because it's become a sort of cult film 55 years later. The result was of really push. The Janetta Cochrane Theatre in London, which was owned by the Central School of Art, they offered to host it for Christmas. And I managed to get a bit of money together, and we had a little company from my Oxford days to do adult reviews and things. But my co-partners said, yes, okay, we'll do your children's play. And we got it on, and that was the beginning of it all, because we got 2 good reviews, the box office phone, and there was only one. There was just one box office phone line. And sometimes I used to go in to help in the box office because there was one very nice elderly lady who was trying to cope, but it really took off. And we went back there the next year and we did it again. And for me, the rest was history in a sense, because that convinced me that that was where I should be. And that the children's theatre thing, albeit an area that was very undervalued, underrated, second division, but nevertheless, that was where I should be. I continued acting. I went on until, I was still doing stage and television until the 80s, early 80s. And I've done quite a lot of acting since, but, and I still feel that in my heart, I'm a performer really, but the children's theatre thing, I created, I suppose, this niche for myself and ended up writing, 70, 75 of these plays. Became like a drug. I couldn't stop doing. No, I was very fortunate because people were asking me to do it and people were commissioning me to do it. And then when I formed my own company, Whirlygig, that was really because I wanted to tour the shows. We'd put them on occasionally in London, not only at the Cochrane, but also by then we'd done a season of Owl and Pussycat Went to Sea. That was at the Apollo. And we'd also done The Plotters of Cabbage Patch Corner, which was an original play of mine at the Shore. And we were the very first Christmas show to do the Shore Theatre, thanks to Eddie Koulakundis, who put us in there for 2 Christmas seasons. So that was what happened. But there was always this feeling that the adult thing, maybe I wasn't either cut out for or that wasn't meant to be. Having said that, of course, the years go by, and I co-wrote with John Gould, who was a composer, musical performer, with whom I'd been at Oxford, and we'd done cabaret together, we'd written musicals together, and we did an adaptation of The Luck of the Bodkins, which is a P.G. Wodehouse novel, and it was done at the Theatre Royal Windsor, and sadly didn't take off, although I think it was all right. So I had done the odd thing, and then suddenly The Go-Between came along, and this was Richard Taylor, the composer, who had done music for my version of Tom's Midnight Garden at the Manchester Library Theatre. And he got in touch and said that he wanted to do a musical version of L.P. Hartley's The Go-Between, which I knew as a book, and I loved the film. And anyway, it took 10 years to get it on, but we did. And we ended up with Michael Crawford playing in it, again at the Apollo, funnily enough, in a limited season. Well, it was a 10-week season, which was lovely. And Roger Haynes directed it beautifully. So, but that was the first grown-up show I think I'd written for about 35 years. Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I don't know. You can say you follow your nose, really, and then what I knew was that I just felt I could do the children's thing. I felt that was what I was there for, if you like, and it was partly because of my children's magic, because I'd learnt how children react en masse, and I put that into the shows. So there's a lot of participation in the shows, which is a bit more creative than in a pantomime. Although I used to write pantomimes for the Queen's Hornchurch each year. But rather than it just being, have you had a good time? If you had lots to eat or something like that, or even he's behind you, it would be more creative than that, whereby they were making important decisions within the play, a lot of which were my decisions, in the sense that I had to work out exactly how they would react, and you could say be manipulative, but that was part of it. In order to help make them enjoy themselves, I had to manipulate. A lot of people used to question the fact that in my Samuel French scripts, it often used to have the audience as a character.
Yes.
And they'd say, you've given the audience lines to say. And I said, well, yes, it's my job to know what they're going to say. And, very occasionally, maybe I'd have been wrong, which was fine. But on the whole, I was right, because there was only one thing they could say, really. There was only one thing. But the wonderful thing was that each individual child in that audience thought that they were the only child making that decision at the time. And even though there were hundreds of them all shouting out the same thing, nevertheless, they had been empowered to make that decision themselves. And I still find that very exciting. And I think that's one thing that theatre can do, particularly for children, because they have this willingness to suspend disbelief in a totally different way, in a more honest way than adults do. I mean, when adults join in a pantomime, they have their tongues firmly in their cheek.
Yes.
Oh, yes, he did. Oh, yeah. Oh, isn't this fun? Whereas a child is actually serious about wanting something to happen. And I don't think they believe that what they're seeing is real. I think they do understand that they're being told a story. But at the same time, that their willingness to suspend the disbelief is a real thing which tips over, rather than it being a rather slightly embarrassed, tongue-in-cheek response that adults give.
Yeah, it's like when you see a child at a pantomime actually stood on the seat screaming, he's behind you. You know they really believe it, don't they?
Well, that's right. I mean, they're not just doing it for fun.
No.
They are concerned. They care, and that's another thing which is very important in children's theatre. Well, in all theatre, really, that we care about the characters that we see, or we care about the situation. And if it's unfair, I mean, one of the things I use endlessly is the whole thing of injustice or unfairness, because children have an innate, I think, inborn sense of injustice. And this explains perhaps why Cinderella is the most popular story in the world, because we root for Cinderella. And I think of a lot of my plays and my adaptations. I mean, Goodnight, Mr. Tom, William Beach, we root for him, this child, the orphan child in The Witches, we root for him. Sophie in the BFG, she's an orphan too, we root for her. Dahl knew this. I mean, in Dahl's books, they kill off the parents in the first 2 pages. But this is a wonderful tool or weapon that I think we have, whereby if we can emotionally involve an audience of children, it's a very special thing, and get them, really annoyed with what's going on. So the character that they have identified with, which very often, I mean, it's like in a children's book. I mean, if the child protagonist is the one that they identify with, and they're being treated badly. Well, they're obviously going to feel, and that's terribly important. I mean, if they don't care, if they don't feel something, then we may as well all go home, really.
Yeah. When I've been to Edinburgh, quite often I've sought out some of the children's theatre companies, because some of their work is the most imaginative you'll see at the Fringe. But outside Edinburgh and Christmas, children's theatre tends to be just one-offs here and there. You know, they come for a couple of afternoon performances or something like that, which is really difficult for us reviewers because you don't get to see it. You don't get to see that sort of theatre. But as Whirlygig, you had a strategy, didn't you, of touring that meant you could spend a bit more time in each place.
No, I think you're right. Having said that, where I think the work that we did with Whirlygig and also other companies over the last 25 years or more, Polka to a certain extent, Unicorn, obviously, and some of the touring companies, particularly the smaller scale ones, which is where, as you say, the real imaginative work is going on. So that Theatre Rights or Oily Cart, brilliant work, and very often work for special needs as well, extraordinary work. And that's all great. But as far as the mainstream theatres are concerned, I mean, when I started, a children's show touring to, say, the Bristol Hippodrome or the Birmingham Hippodrome would have been unheard of. They just wouldn't have thought of it at all. But we did manage to break down some of those barriers so that now you find that in many regional theatres and commercial theatres, children's theatre is actually an integral part of the programming, which it never was before. And they'd be looking, yes, you may be right. I mean, My Tiger Who Came to Tea, which has been going now for 15 years. I've been directing it for 15 years, which is crazy, really. But that's touring at the moment again. And a second production is in preparation for the Haymarket, for the West End in the summer. And what we find on the tour is that most theatres want to have it for 2 or 3 days and no more. Now, that's really what you were saying. But of course, they do 2 shows in a day, sometimes 3. So it may well be. I mean, I was in Wellingborough yesterday, in the Castle Theatre, Wellingborough, to see the company and give notes. And they were doing 6 performances in 3 days. They'd already played at the Theatre Royal Bath, much bigger theatre, and of course a very prestigious theatre, and they'd virtually sold out 4 performances there over Easter. And then tomorrow they have the day off, and then the next day they open at Red Roof in Cornwall. I mean, it's an extraordinary roller coaster for them all, but they'll be doing 4 performances there. Now, the theory is that if you can sell out those performances or do very well in those performances, it's better than doing a whole week in which you only sell half the tickets or whatever. But it's a bit more than that. It's a thing whereby I think theatre managers, theatre directors, they would not really always want to see a children's show taking up a full week. Now, they might put in a couple of concerts or a couple of comedians or something. Sometimes they might put something on top of us. Well, that's all right. But then you get others. I mean, if we go to the town hall in Birmingham, for instance, we would always go there for a full week. And that's partly because they know they can sell it. I mean, we've been there many times, but they wouldn't have known that 25 years ago, say, and I think they would have been very cautious. And then you have Christmas seasons, of course. I mean, you can have a children's show on for 2, 3, 4 weeks or whatever over Christmas. But I don't know. I think that that side of it doesn't worry me so much, as long as the theatres are willing to A, put the show on in the first place, but B, accept the fact that the seat price is going to be relatively low, because what you're trying to do is to obviously appeal to families who might normally go to theatre anyway, and bless them for that. But what is, for me, more important, really, is to get school parties, because school parties, you get to children who never would get the chance of going to the theatre unless the school took them. Now, if that price is too high, and God knows with the cost of living crisis at the moment, schools are reluctant to go to the parents and ask for money for anything. I mean, they're asking them for money for pencils, for God's sake. I mean, so a theatre trip, which involves not only the price of the ticket, but also the price of the seat on the coach, which is arguably going to cost more than the seat price of the ticket, which is extraordinary. One can understand how, it's a knife-edge thing, because we got to the stage, say, 10, 15 years ago, where primary schools were more than willing, a lot of them, to come to the theatre on a regular basis, to give their children an experience once a year or something like that. Well, it's much more difficult now. The pandemic didn't help, obviously, but the cost of living thing has made it even more difficult. So when theatre directors look at the implications financially of bringing in shows like ours, one can understand that they think twice. But as I said, what is really exciting to me is the fact that so many more of them, maybe because they've been brought up, I mean, they're of the age that they actually went to the theatre and they saw children's plays when they were young, but they actually see it as part of their job to bring children into the theatre, and therefore part of their job to bring children's shows to their theatre, and hopefully that will continue. But I think it will mean that sometimes the children's show will be on top of another show. Tiger went round recently, occasionally anyway, playing on top of The Girl from the North Country. It was worked out that the two sets would fit together, and the two companies talked admirably, really, and very well in advance of how it was going to work, and very helpfully, so that the lighting rig of Girl from the North Country was adapted to a certain extent to work for us as well. And I'm all in favour of that. I mean, cooperation in that way. And of course, for theatres like, say, Newcastle Theatre Royal, they would be doing the regular 8 performances of Girl from the North Country, and they'd probably be doing 8 performances of our show. So their potential return financially was very good. And yes, they've got extra staff costs to pay and all the rest of it. It's all, it's not all gravy. But at the same time, if it can be made to work, then, I think the lovely thing is that they want it to work. Whereas when I started, I got the impression that they didn't. Yeah.
I'm based in Manchester. As the Lowry, I think both of those shows came. I didn't notice whether they came together, but that's an interesting idea to collaborate like that, which I didn't know about.
Yeah, well, years ago, it was discussed. I mean, with my company, Whirlygig, there was a suggestion that came, I think, partly from the Arts Council. The Arts Council never gave us revenue funding. We used to have to apply every year for a project grant, and this was very frightening, because we would be booked into theatres well in advance, and we would be printing the publicity, and we didn't know whether we were going to have a grant that would be enough to make us able to do it. It was real knife-edge stuff. But somehow we sort of got through. Well, we had this idea, and the Arts Council supported the idea of us doing 2 shows, one of which was a children's show and one of which was a grown-up show. And they were actually designed to fit on top of each other. And it had been tried once before. Michael Bogdanov tried it when with, I think it was Leicester Haymarket, and there was a children's show of his called Billy Bodger's Magic Circus, and they did it on top of a Beatles compilation show called Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. I'm going back now 40 years maybe. Now, the problem with it was, and this is what we experienced when we offered theatres this possibility, you got some theatres that wanted the adult show but didn't want the children's show, because they said, no, we've got Postman Pat coming 2 weeks later. We don't want to muddy the waters. And then you got others who said, oh, yes, we'd love to have the children's show, but quite honestly, we don't want the adult show because we've got something a bit like whatever. And so you suddenly had these weeks where it was all out of kilter, and financially you couldn't make that work at all. You couldn't balance it. And so that's why, in the case of Tiger going on top of Girl from the North Country, it only happened in certain weeks. And they were weeks where the theatre were interested to have both shows, and it worked for them. But we weren't touring around in the same lorry or anything.
Right.
I mean, we would go off and do our bit somewhere else and then come back. And they would have opened, say, on the Tuesday night, and we would come back and open probably on the Wednesday afternoon or whatever. And but it was amicable. This was the great thing, that it is possible.
Another kind of theatre that you did a while ago was theatre in education, touring to schools, which is a very different idea, different venues, different types of venues. But that's another one that was at the mercy of government policy and funding policies that completely changed in the 80s, in particular, when groups were accused of being too political as well, and they were attacked through the funding. So what's your memory of that time?
What you've just said is a very good summary, really. When I left Oxford, we were very lucky, first of all, because we did a review at the Edinburgh Festival called 4 Degrees Over, which transferred to the West End. We were at the Fortune, which had been the home of Beyond the Fringe, and people thought we were another Beyond the Fringe. Sadly, we weren't. But we were there for about 3 months, and we recorded our cast album of songs produced by the legendary George Martin, who was doing the Beatles at the same time. So that was good. But after that, I didn't know quite what to do, but I was offered a job in a TIE company at Watford, and it was the very first TIE company at Watford. And what had happened was that in those late 60s, the Belgrade Coventry started theatre and education. It was really thanks to them that everything blossomed or mushroomed, shall we say, afterwards. And when several of the people who had learnt their craft in TIE and gone into the schools and done project work and then worked with the children afterwards, when there were quite a few of them who'd gone through, suddenly it was as though they were evangelists, and they were sent out to various outposts around the country. And one of them, called Mick Jones, came to Watford. And Giles Havergal, who was then running Watford, who later went to the Citizens Glasgow, I had come into contact with when I was still at Oxford. And he very kindly, he knew about my magic and so on. He said, "Would you like to come do this?" And so I did. And I found it very exciting. We did a play, like a lot of people around about that time, about the Tay Bridge disaster, which was all about collective responsibility, who was responsible for the bridge falling down. And we would talk to children, and it was very rewarding. And I think it was quite good. In the company was Bill Bryden, who later went on to work at the National and to be a very fine director. And also there was an actress whose name is going to escape me now, but she later became quite famous as Paul Temple's partner, as it were, on television. Ros Drinkwater, she was called. Right. Funny name. But I think I learnt a lot from it, and I wrote a project later on. I wrote a play about Boadicea or Boudica, where the children worked all day, some of them being the Iceni tribe and some of them being Romans, and then they came into conflict and everything, and then they had the play and so on, and it was, all interesting. My problem was that I wanted the children that I was seeing in the classroom to come to the theatre, because for me, the theatre was the exciting place. Where as a child, I had experienced the lights going down and the music starting and the lights, and all those things. And unfortunately, round about that time and after, this was looked upon as a very middle-class occupation or middle-class institution, shall we say, the whole idea of going to a theatre. A theatre building was a middle-class institution. And a lot of the TIE people, and let's face it, I mean, most of us in the theatre are left of centre, well, some are further left than others. And some of the ones that were further left than others did start doing plays which perhaps were not as balanced as they might be.
Yes.
For right or for wrong. And while I was thinking, I want to be in the theatre and I want these children to come to the theatre, they were doing slightly political things. Maybe for the secondary schools, I was more to do with the primary schools. But TIE, having developed, I think, really in a very successful way. Suddenly, as you implied earlier on, there were criticisms, and it was round about the Thatcher time. And there were one or two famous examples of where funding was withdrawn from companies because it was felt that they were not brainwashing exactly, but they were, perhaps going a bit far. And I got into trouble from these TIE companies sometimes because I was looked upon by this time in theatre as a bit commercial. And I remember there was a conference of TIE and children's theatre, and I was asked to speak, and I was attacked from the floor from someone who I admired actually very much, who ran a TIE company in Bolton. And because I was told that I had written this very middle-class play, which was totally wrong for children, which was called The Owl and the Pussycat Went to Sea. And this was about an owl and a pussycat who wanted to get married. And marriage is a middle-class institution, and children should not be encouraged to think that marriage is necessarily a good idea. You can do a project about marriage where you show them the rights and wrongs or pros and cons of marriage, but you can't do a play like this. Well, I sort of, maybe rather lamely, because I was a bit surprised, I argued my case. And it was true that that play by then was being done by a lot of repertory companies up and down the country. But there was this feeling that a lot of these people who worked in TIE, who probably were there because, like me, they'd been influenced by the lights going down and the band playing and watching something on stage, they were the ones who were saying that children shouldn't be encouraged to go into this middle-class institution called a theatre. Now, I couldn't agree with that. So I carried on in my way. At no point did I criticize the notion of TIE because I totally believed in it. But I just believed that children's theatre could, not even as the other side of the coin, but as an allied theatre art form, it was as valid, put it that way. As the years went by, I began to feel that although I didn't feel that my plays, my original plays, or some of my adaptations, I didn't feel that they were tinsel in the sense that, they weren't elves round the village green. They weren't simplistic. I think they were relatively literate and all that. But I did start thinking that it might be possible to combine some elements of TIE with those of children's theatre. And I suppose the first manifestation of that was when I had my own company and I had been able to do some of my own plays, which was wonderful. And I think I was watching a Blue Peter program, and they were talking about seagulls who had been coated with oil and for whom there was no hope. They had to be put down because you couldn't get this oil off them. And so I ended up writing this play called The Selfish Shellfish, which was set in a rock pool and the creatures that lived in the rock pool. And there was an oil spillage out at sea, and the seagull came in to warn everybody that things were going on, and the various creatures were having arguments within themselves. They were bickering with each other. So you had this community, but you were looking at it from the point of view of the creatures that lived in the rock pool rather than from a human perspective. And I went to a research station on the East Coast who looked into shellfish and things to find out how they would react to oil, and I was told that it was often a respiratory thing, that their organs would seize up. And so I used that. And I had this character who was called HC, who was a hermit crab who was rather unpleasant, lived in a shell. And there was a mussel. So there was a pun on the idea of a mussel because he was a sort of muscle-bound person who was the servant of HC. And he also fed every morning the giant anemone, which was a great big thing at the time. Anyway, it was fantasy, but it had this undercurrent of reality, if you like, and therefore was educational with a small e, or at least there was stuff you could take out of it in just the same way as with TIE. But it had to be entertaining. I was determined that it had to be, it couldn't be a tract something which was moralistic in that way. But at the end, the seagull, who was the character that we all came to like, who was able to be a sort of scout and go off and see what was going on and how quickly the oil slick was approaching. And the oil slick was an actor with huge, I mean, the idea for the play really came from this thing that I thought, wouldn't it be fun to have an actor with a cloak which covered the whole stage? And so the oil slick was this character, and he had long extended arms and this sort of parachute silk ululating, if that's the right, undulating cloak, covering the stage, but which of course was very theatrical and very exciting.
Yeah.
And at the end, towards the end, the seagull dies, swallowed up by the oil slick. And then the actors all sort of came to life again afterwards, having put on their character forming headdresses and so on. But they started off as actors at the beginning. And that had quite a big effect on me because it was successful. And it sort of struck a chord, I think, and the schools went for it because there was something national curriculum feeling about it, although it wasn't based on the right book or anything. And so I ended up writing another one called the Seesaw Tree, which was about an oak tree which was in danger of being chopped down and the creatures that lived on it. And then I wrote one called Save the Human, which was about in the future when the grown-ups or the human people have mucked up the world to such an extent that there are very few left, and there are now animals in charge of the world, and the remaining adults do things which animals do now. So you had pet humans, and you had guide humans for blind animals, and everything was reversed. And I did that as a book as well. It started off as a book which wasn't picked up, but then we did the play, and the book was picked up. But so, in other words, what I'm trying to say is that the notion of TIE, I think there was a cross-fertilization of TIE and children's theatre. Not just me, but other people were feeling that as well, because children's theatre was beginning to expand. TIE was in decline because of the reasons we've mentioned. And suddenly, they were on the back foot a bit. And a lot of the TIE people felt quite reasonably, well, maybe we've got to swallow our pride a bit. We've got to go into a bit of children's theatre world in order to get bookings which are not so overtly educational and which might be therefore looked upon as things which are a bit one-sided or whatever. So I think the situation we're in now is that there is not nearly enough theatre and education. But you could say there's not nearly enough children's theatre. I don't know. I mean, the problem, we have this ever recurring problem of money, of attitude from funding bodies, sponsorship people, and so on. I mean, it's much better now than it was. Much better now than it was. I mean, what I find now when I'm casting is that there are actors who actually want to do it. I mean, 25 years ago or something, they were desperate for work, so they come along and audition. And my job was to try and suss out whether they would be really cynical when they started work and thinking, oh God, I'd rather be doing a big musical, or I'd rather be doing Shakespeare. And you still have to sort of, to a certain extent, but there are people who revel in it and are really good at it and who enjoy playing animals or creatures, or I don't know. There's one of my actors who, well, he's sort of retired now, but he's played everything from. He used to have a CV thing in the program which said Mike Ellis. His name was. He said Mike Ellis has worked for David Wood many times. He's played a cuckoo, a slug, a salt pot. There's a great list of all these objects and animals, and a piece of silver paper in one play. And he said his ambition now is to play a human being. Well, that was a joke, but some people took it seriously. But I mean, he loved this thing of playing characters like that, whereas some people hate the idea.
Yeah.
So you've got to find the right people. But there are now designers, there are now playwrights, there are now composers and directors and so on who specialize in the work, who perhaps wouldn't have done before, and are not necessarily seeing it as a rung on the ladder to real theatre. I mean, that was always the danger, that people thought that what they were doing was not really the real thing. It was, third division even.
Yeah, I remember speaking to an actor probably about 20 years ago. I was speaking to an actor when I was doing some TAE. writing and directing it. And he said something along the lines of, yes, I've done that, as though, that's behind me. I've served my apprenticeship and I don't need to do it again.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's as though they've ticked that off the list, but it is on their list. It's at the bottom of the list. Yeah. It's not at the top of the list. And so it is like a ladder. And that, to me, I'm afraid, that doesn't work for me, because what it tends to mean is that they don't really want to be there. And of course, a children's audience don't understand why they can see through that, but they can see through it.
Yeah.
And they don't actually say, oh dear, that actor's being insincere. But there is something that tells them that actor isn't quite on the right wavelength, or isn't quite giving the right thing. I don't know. It's fascinating. But I mean, what I do know is that probably 90% or more of our profession would run away from the idea of going out at 9:30, 10 o'clock in the morning in front of 60 children in a school hall, or 600 or 1,600. I mean, we were at the Theatre Royal Norwich the other week, and I was at a Saturday morning show at 10:30, and there were 1,500 in the audience, and it was the most wonderful performance. I mean, it was great. Not schools, obviously. This was all yummy mummies and yummy daddies, and thank God they came. But the reaction was so exciting, and the actors have got to feel that. They've got to respond to that and feel that is exciting when there's that buzz of reaction, which can be. Well, it can be the whole thing of laughter, and it can be the whole thing of participation and joining in. But at the same time, and this is the important thing, and the wonderful Irving Wardle, who was the critic for the Times for years and who became a dear friend until he died very recently, he wrote a review of one of my shows in 1972 or something like that. And around about that time, he called me the National Children's Dramatist, which was a thing that I mercilessly have used ever since.
Yeah.
But he came out with this review of it was The Gingerbread Man when we were at the Old Vic, and he talked about it being the loudest audience participation he'd ever heard, but more remarkably, the most silent silences. In other words, the important thing is that they listen. The important thing is that they get involved in the story. The participation, fine, but we can all make children make a lot of noise in a theatre. I mean,
yes.
When I was in pantomime myself at Watford, I just went out and said hello, and you get a big reaction, and have you had a nice Christmas? That's easy. But the great thing is to actually make them listen and want to know what is coming next, and follow the story and be part of it and have that experience, which I do think it's a sort of unique experience, which these days, sadly, they're on their screens so much, whether they're small screens, middle-sized screens, or large screens. And I do feel that they miss out, because that communal experience, I mean, I've never been to a football match, but I would imagine that there is a similar feeling of being part of a crowd at a football match, being in an audience where you're all focused and wanting something to happen. I don't know. I mean, it just seems to be, it's the sort of thing with children that I think is one of those things that should be on a list of things that they should be given, like learning to swim, like getting a library book out for nothing or whatever. There are certain rights, I think, that a child should have. And I think one of them should be a theatre experience, which, whether or not you have some sort of thing where, I mean, I was chair for years of a thing called Action for Children's Arts, and they've made me the president now. I hate the word president because it makes me think of America and the previous president there. But one of the things that we instigated, and is still going on, and there's still pilot schemes happening, is what's called an arts backpack. And the idea is that every child, and this is funded by government, maybe sponsored, but the idea is that every child would have each year 5 experiences within the arts, which might involve going to an art gallery, maybe going to a concert, maybe going to a theatre, maybe a theatre company coming to the school. But 5, they are guaranteed things which the school would organise and would be somehow paid for. And there are similar schemes in one or two Scandinavian countries, and we've looked into that. And we've done a few pilot schemes which have been successful, but obviously on a small scale. But it's that thing of, I'm afraid it's that thing, and we come back to elitism, I suppose, that thing that the vast majority of children perhaps in this country would not get the opportunity to do some of these things because the parents wouldn't automatically take them. And there's no reason why we should expect them to take them. I mean, if they weren't taken as children, whatever. Yeah. But the school teacher, I mean, and God bless school teachers who actually, take a great party of children on a coach and have to count them in and count them out and everything. God, what a responsibility. I'm so impressed by the teachers who feel that it's important enough to actually do it. And they've got to be encouraged to do it. And there's got to be, it shouldn't be that they have to beg parents for more money or beg the school fund for more money. And that it should be made possible as a children's right to have certain things like that. I always remember years ago when I did Megan Mogg's show at Unicorn, and we did it 5 times, and I can't remember which version this was, but it was all schools one afternoon, and they'd all gone, and there was just one child left and in the foyer, and she was ever so good. I mean, she was only about 6 years old, I think, but she actually knew her phone number, which was remarkable. She knew that her mother probably wouldn't be in because her mother was a nurse and was at work. She ended up having a wonderful guided tour of the theatre and being taken out for a meal and everything, and finally being chauffeur-driven back with someone from the theatre to her home address when they managed to get hold of the mother. But you think of that poor teacher, must have really got into trouble. The head teacher must have been furious. You left one behind. They didn't count them all out. No, but I do think that the TIE thing is a very, very useful tool, an educational tool, but it shouldn't necessarily be automatically assumed that that is theatre. It can be, but it isn't automatically theatre. And I don't think that them having it in their school hall, I mean, yes, you can do a certain amount. I'm not denying that. But the thing of going out into a building, and I'm afraid I do like that atmosphere of theatre buildings. I remember when we played the Old Vic, first of all, which was with my gingerbread man, Cameron McIntosh, and I put it on at the Old Vic for 2 Christmas seasons. And there were a lot of inner city parties of children who were paid for by what was in those days the Inner London Education Authority. And they would actually give a certain amount of money, and the schools would pitch for tickets. They would get tickets. And so you had what was in those days an incredibly diverse audience, which was very exciting. I remember coming into one, and I mean, the atmosphere was quite extraordinary. It was full. And the fact was that maybe 75-85% of those children would never have been in a theatre before in their lives. And therefore, for us, it was the most important day of their lives. We had to get it right. Yeah. Otherwise, we put them off for life. But what I do remember is witnessing them coming in to the Old Vic auditorium. And they'd all be crying, and then when they came, it's like when people might go into a cathedral or something for the first time, a sort of gasp. Yeah. And I'm not saying it stayed forever by any means, but there was this feeling of awe. Yeah. Which, I don't know, some people would say that would be a bad thing, probably, but I felt it was rather good because they actually felt something just by being in that building, which was an exciting new experience for them. Yeah.
Going back to, I could talk to you all day about this sort of stuff, but just going back to the book, I noticed that Frank's criticisms, they started off sort of gentle encouragement, and he gradually got more and more detailed as though he was getting the confidence to, he knew he wasn't actually offending you by saying this, but how important was that feedback to you? How do you think he's influenced how you've developed?
No, it was very important, and there were 2 specific projects. There were more to a certain extent, but there were two specific ones where he smelt a rat before I did. And he implied that maybe this wasn't going to work. Not from, a financial or a producer's point of view, but simply the thing of doing it, of writing it and getting it right or adapting it. And one of them was this book, which I'm very fond of, called The Dancing Bear by Michael Morpurgo. And Morpurgo himself asked me to adapt it. This was before Warhorse, years ago. And I liked it, and I did quite a lot of work on it. And I was going to do it with Tony Hatch, who I had written a musical called Rock Nativity with, and thoroughly enjoyed working with him. And anyway, it never happened. But if you read the criticism that Frank had of the book, of the story, the way the story worked, he was absolutely right, because it was very difficult to make this dancing bear the main character, which it should have been about the bear, but somehow it wasn't. It was skewed off. And there were a couple of other examples of this. And there were times when he joined in where I was not lost exactly, but where I was on new territory, when I did Philip Pullman's Clockwork as an opera for Unicorn, which was done in the end at the Linbury, at the Opera House. And I'd never done a libretto before. And he was very encouraging about that. And then he actually started being quite picky and saying the syllables here, wouldn't it be better if? And I can say that most times he was right. He was not correct when talking about the witches. We had a long debate about the witches, because he was saying that Dahl himself should narrate it, because Dahl appears to narrate the book. But the voice, when they talk about, a novel, they say, whose voice is it?
Yeah.
That voice of Dahl, to my mind, wasn't Dahl. It was the boy. And although it was in the first person, and I thought it became very, very complicated if you had this narrator who then got turned into a mouse, because he ends up still a mouse. I mean, in the book, the film changed it all, because the film people decided it had to have a so-called happy ending, but far better the book ending. And I just couldn't see how Dahl could be standing there if you had this personification of Dahl narrating, and then he turns into a mouse, and it's the same voice from this mouse. But there was a long debate about that, some of it which is there in the book. And I think he was wrong, and he sort of admitted that he was wrong about that. But his first instinct on Coram Boy, I had this extraordinary experience of I was the first person to attack Coram Boy, and got it thrown back in my face when eventually my version wasn't done. You probably haven't got to that bit yet.
No.
But, no, I was going to do it for Unicorn, and it's a long story. And eventually my version was sent to the National, because they wanted to see it, because they were desperate for something for Christmas. And of course they came back and they said that they liked the book, but they didn't like my adaptation. So they then managed to get the rights, which Unicorn had given up by then. And they didn't even invite me in for a cup of tea. And my version was done for a cast of 8 or 10 or something. And they did it with 35. But they didn't give me the chance to sort of redo it. They went to Helen Edmondson, who is very good. I've got nothing against Helen Edmondson. And I think she did a great job when I went to see it. I was disappointed in some areas, but on the whole, I thought she did a tremendous job. But there were times with that where he got very involved, and he really got to know the book. It's quite a long and complicated plot, but he was really on top of it. And then he started finding the odd flaw, which he thought that I had probably been slightly misled by, or it meant it was difficult to do or whatever. And I always took note of what he said. And if I sometimes didn't quite believe it, later on, I found that he was probably 90% of the time right. There was a whole thing with Fantastic Mr. Fox, which I was doing at great speed for the Belgrade Coventry. They commissioned it and wanted it delivered 2 months later or something. And I'd written in detail about this revolving raked platform. And the idea was that all the animals were having a feast, a celebration, sitting around this thing. And that when it revolved, you were able to see, when it was the high bit, you could see underneath where there were various tunnels and so on. And Frank went into great detail saying that this was impractical, that this couldn't work. Because the height would have to be so much here and and even little diagrams he did and everything, which was wonderful, really. And of course, he was right. He was totally right. And although they did in the end use a revolve, it was used in a totally different way. So no, he was very practical, and he understood. Although he had never really worked in the professional theatre, where they had resources perhaps that were greater than in amateur theatre. Nevertheless, he was able to think, well, that would be ridiculously expensive to do, and it probably wouldn't work anyway. And I respected all his thoughts, because he took such care. He read these things so carefully. And even when you get near the end, he was obviously very ill. And I can't remember what the last play he looked at was. It may have been Danny, Champion of the World. But he was at that stage falling asleep quite a lot and unable to concentrate quite a lot. But my goodness, the lucidity of his thought and his going through, quite remarkable. And no, I was always grateful, because he took it so seriously. And a lot of people, because it's to do with children, they assume it's easy. They assume, it's kid stuff. And of course, it really isn't. I mean, I'm not saying it's more difficult than writing for adults. I wouldn't be sort of as pompous enough, hopefully, to say that. But nevertheless, it's not easy. And just to assume that you can, it's only for kids. I mean, that whole attitude of it's only for kids, which has haunted me for years and years and years, because that's what a lot of people say. And, when you do something which has got a lot of lighting cues, which has got a number of scene changes, which are quite complicated and everything, it's not really expected. And I mean, the thing, when we used to go touring, my Whirlygig shows were really quite big. They would have a cast of 10 or 12, and probably quite a lot of trucks and revolving stuff and psychs and special lighting and so on. I mean, they were not simplistic. But in those days, a lot of the theatres, the major touring theatres, would look at what's coming in next week. Oh, it's that kid show. And they would get the most terrifying shock when they saw what they got to do in order to get the show in. And they said, well, this is a kid show. And you say, yes. And we're here for a full week. We always used to do full weeks with Whirlygig, 2 weeks at Sadler's Wells. But I don't know, I can be very po-faced about it. I can get very serious about it, because I do feel it very seriously. But people have to be cajoled into realizing that it's just as important, if not more important, than adult theatre. And I've always had this thing that it is an art form in its own right. And that, again, it sounds very pompous to say that, but I do believe that just like mime and ballet and opera, I think that children's theatre is an art form with a technique, if you like, all of its own. And the sad thing is that the mere phrase children's theatre somehow still suggests third division. Now, whether that's the word children, whether it's because in this country we're particularly bad at sort of feeling that children are important, I don't know. Somebody once said to me, well, what about France then? Because they seem to think children are very important, and they can go into pubs or the equivalent. Yes. All that. Yes. This was years ago. And I had to look at it and say, well, actually, there isn't as much children's theatre in France probably as there is here. So it's not bad. But it is a national and an international problem. And I went through the phase of going to America quite a lot, partly when they were doing my stuff, and then when I wrote a book about children's theatre called very, very imaginatively Theatre for Children. It became
it's on the shelf behind me. Yeah.
Well, it became a sort of textbook in America more than over here, because in America, the academics take it quite seriously. And the result of that is quite refreshing in some ways, but it does mean that a lot of the theatre practitioners in America, professional ones, are really educationalists or university people who I don't believe are quite as instinctively theatrical as they might be. And that may be an unfair thing to say, but they do at least take the work seriously within those situations, much more than over here. I mean, now there are universities who actually do talk about children's theatre a little bit, because they never used to mention it at all. No. And of course, drama schools never mentioned it either. This was another thing I found. I did start going into particularly Bristol Old Vic Theatre School and Arts Ed, and I used to do the odd workshop or talk about children's theatre just as an option really for them, for the students. And it was fascinating because, you know, the majority of them weren't really interested. I mean, at Arts Ed, they were more interested in getting a job on a cruise ship. But there were some. And indeed, I've had some very good people from Arts Ed who have proved themselves to be brilliant in children's theatre. And similarly, Bristol Old Vic Theatre School as well. I used to do mock auditions there. I used to pretend I was auditioning for the BFG, and they had to come in and pretend to be giants and so on. And a lot of them hated it. But there were some who relished it. And some of those went on, not to children's theatre, but to do rather good things elsewhere. I remember Adrian Scarborough, who I think is a rather brilliant actor.
Yeah.
I actually offered a job to him when he was still a student. I thought he'd be brilliant in children's theatre, and he would, but he never had to resort to that. Or in fact, you know, he may not have wanted to anyway, but he had all the qualities and he understood. No, sadly, it took a long time before the drama schools even admitted that there was anything called children's theatre. And they might at the end of the course, you know, people do this 3-year course and on the last few days, they might be told, well, to get an equity card, you know, why don't you just try and get into a children's theatre company? Without telling them it was arguably the most difficult job they'd ever do, you know. But also, I mean, now, of course, they don't have to have an equity card to work. So that has changed, which is probably a very good thing. But nevertheless, just as an option, the idea of working for children, if I go and talk to students, I find that a lot of them are intrigued by it because they've never really thought of it. Although when you say to them, you know, why did you want to go into the theatre? It's quite often interesting that some of them, yes, pantomime, commercial pantomime, but quite a lot of them have been taken to see, if not one of mine, but quite a lot of them, one of my Dahl adaptations when they were, you know, 7, 8, 9 years old or something. So there is a connection between their theatre-going experience as a child and the fact that they became interested enough to want to do it. Jonathan Church, who I suppose I got to know him first when he was at Birmingham Rep, and then he went to Chichester, and he commissioned Goodnight, Mr. Tom, which is the play that we won the Olivier with in the end. And Jonathan, he didn't direct that production, but he has done 1 or 2 of mine. And he endeared himself to me one day by saying that the reason why he had gone into theatre was that when he was 8 or 9 or 10 or something, was taken to see my Plotters of Cabbage Patch Corner, which I mentioned earlier, at the Shaw Theatre. And one of the giveaways that Clark's Shoes, who were our sponsors then, Clark's Shoes made this toy theatre, which you could cut out and make with all the characters. And apparently he religiously did this, or his parents helped him. And he used to do the play, you know, rather like a Pollock's toy theatre. And he credited me with having sparked the imagination that made him want to go into theatre. Well, that's lovely. I mean, you know, and there've been 1 or 2 others. Phil Wilmot is another one who said that one of my plays started him off. Well, you know, that's great. But I think the industry as a whole still underrates, undervalues children's theatre. They don't see it as something which I believe. I mean, I've always resisted. I mean, people have often said, "Oh, it's marvelous, David. Your work. You know, you get all these children going, and they're all going to be going when they're adults, and they'll all be filling up the theatres for Cameron Mackintosh and all this." And I always say, well, you know, good, okay, that's a good offshoot, but that's not why I'm doing it. I'm not just doing it in order to create an audience for Cameron. much as I love him. And I mean, we've been working together since our 20s, but that's not why I do it. I do it for them now because I think they deserve it and they have the right to it now, just as adults do. And any investment in the future is well, it's not immaterial, but it's a useful adjunct to what we're doing, But no, it's very difficult to get people, certainly Arts Council people. I mean, they will very often say, "Oh, yes, we care desperately about children's theatre," and "Oh, yes, we've told such and such a theatre that they must do something." Well, it wasn't really until the lottery came in that a lot of theatres showed any interest in children's theatre at all. And the reason they did, I mean, I live in Wimbledon, and Wimbledon Theatre, and I knew the people there, and I'd had a couple of shows on there. They rang me up one day, the artistic director or the manager or whatever, and he said, "David said, would you be willing to come onto the board of Wimbledon Theatre?" And I said, I've been on the board of Polka Theatre. I said, "I don't know that it's relevant for me to be on your board." No, he said, "Yes, we want you to be on your board." And eventually I persuaded him to own up to why this was. And it was because they were putting in a lottery bid to refurbish a lot of the theatre. And in order to qualify, they had to fill in a box which said that there was some sort of commitment to working for children, whether that was a children's workshop type thing, a club or a classes, or whether a youth theatre, or whether just bringing them in to see shows or whatever it was. And so I was the token children's theatre person on the board in order to tick a box. And actually, I mean, I quite enjoyed my time on the board, and I was the only, Paul Elliott, the theatre producer, he and I were the only two theatre people on the board. The rest of them were councillors and so on. And I think, we managed to do a bit of good. But a lot of theatres were like that. A lot of theatres suddenly realised that they had to have an education officer. They'd never had one before. And they had to have someone liaising with teachers. And what was this all about? And we're still in that situation because there are more theatres now that actually have education officers than ever before. And that's in big commercial theatres as well, where it would have been absolutely unheard of. So, we have developed, we have come a certain distance, but what we still know is that the moment any cuts have to be exercised or brought in because of financial problems, it'll be the youth theatre or the children's that will probably suffer the biggest cuts. They're the obvious target, which is terribly sad, but I suppose it's inevitable. I don't know.
That was David Wood OBE, whose book Frank Exchanges is due to be published by the Book Guild on the 28th of June 2023. See bookguild.co.uk for more details, or for more information about David and his work, see www.davidwood.org.uk. You've been listening to a podcast from British Theatre Guide. For more information, please visit britishtheatreguide.info.